Tired. Just do it. If I don't read now, it would be less likely that I would read during the day. I mean, there's no correlation. I just understand. I just know myself well enough. The best time to read some books is in the early morning. Like later during the day, I wouldn't really want to carve out time to read. Okay. BC. Skip the USFL. Okay. Chapter 12. Ice Capatus. Capatus. Ice Capatus. Rebuilding Warmint Rink. I never had a master plan. I just got fed up one day and decided to do something about it. On the morning of May 22nd, 1986, there was a story on the front page of the New York Times saying that New York City officials had decided to start all over in their effort to rebuild the Warmint skating rink in Central Park. If everything went well, said the city, the rink would be ready to reopen in approximately 2 years. I couldn't believe it. First of all, there was no reason to believe anything would go well, much less everything. The Warmint Rink, built in 1950, had first closed for renovations in June 1980. The work was scheduled to take 2.5 years. 2.5 years. Even that seemed like a long time to rebuild an ice skating rink. Coincidentally, in June 1980, I broke ground for Trump Tower, a 68-story skyscraper with 6 floors of shopping, thousands of square feet of office space, and 263 residential apartments. 2.5 years later, we completed Trump Tower, on time and on budget. From my new apartment, I had a view of Warmint Rink. It was not a pretty sight. Although millions of dollars had already been spent on its renovation, it was obvious, even from a distance, that the rink was nowhere near finished. 3 more years passed, millions more dollars was spent, and things just got worse, so bad, in fact, that on this May morning in 1986, the city felt compelled to announce it was starting the whole process over from scratch. I knew absolutely nothing about building ice skating rinks, but I did know something about construction. If it took me 2.5 years to put up a major skyscraper, surely it was possible to build a $2 million ice skating rink in a matter of months. 2 years earlier, when the job was already a disaster, I had called Henry Stern, Commissioner of Parks, and offered to take over construction from the city for no fee. He turned me down. Now, after reading about this latest debacle, I called Henry again and repeated my offer. He had the same response. No thanks. He said, we can do it ourselves. That's great, Henry, I said, except that you told me the same thing 2 years ago, and look what happened. I decided to write a very strongly worded letter to Ed Koch, the mayor of New York. I was appalled by the city's incompetence. I genuinely felt I could get the job done, and I believed the rink was something hundreds of thousands of New Yorkers, including my own children, had a right to enjoy. Whatever anyone may think, my motive was that simple. Dear Ed, my letter began. For many years I have watched with amazement as New York City repeatedly failed on its promises to complete and open the Warmint skating rink. Building the rink, which essentially involves the pouring of a concrete slab over coolant piping, should take no more than 4 months time. To hear that after 6 years, it will now take another 2 years is unacceptable to all the thousands of people who are waiting to skate once again at the women's rink. I and all other New Yorkers are tired of watching the catastrophe of women's rink. The incompetence displayed on this simple construction project must be considered one of the great embarrassments of your administration. I fear that in 2 years there will be no skating at the women's rink, with the general public being the losers. Then I got to the real point. I'm offering to construct and pay for a brand new women's ice skating rink and have it open to the public by November of this winter. I would lease the rink from the city at a fair market rental and run it properly after its completion. I sent a letter to Ed Koch on May 28, 1986. He wrote me a response by return mail. Somewhat to my surprise, he belittled my offer. The city wasn't about to let me operate the rink, he said, but they'd be delighted if I donate the $3 million to rebuild it and supervise the construction. He made a few more sarcastic comments and ended by saying, with a bated breath, I await your response. The tone of the mayor's response irritated me. Fortunately, I wasn't the only one who was put off by it, and I have Koch himself to thank for that. I hadn't released my letter to the press because I didn't want to be accused of grandstanding. Koch, however, decided to release his letter. Apparently, he figured that if he made fun of my offer publicly, I'd just quietly slink away. He totally underestimated the press reaction. First, the press thrives on confrontation. They also love stories about extremes, whether they are great successes or terrible failures. This story had it all. Perhaps most important, many reporters tend to see themselves as consumer advocates. Almost nothing gets them as outraged as a boondoggle that victimizes average citizens. The city's fiasco at the women's rink was an absolute classic. Even I was surprised at how totally the press took my side. Obviously, that doesn't always happen, but this time, within 3 days, there were dozens of articles and editorials attacking Koch for his reaction to my offer. The Koch administration said the Daily News in an editorial, is hemming and hawing over Donald Trump's offer to rebuild and operate women's rink in Central Park. Why? The offer is genuine, with no apparent strings attached. Koch should grab it and have a sigh of relief that a long-running, costly disaster is off his hands. So far, the mayor has raised a lot of phony objections. Maybe the problem is that Koch and co. are embarrassed that they squandered $12 million on women. Trump is offering to take over the woman project to rebuild the rink and to have it open by November at no cost to the city, wrote the New York Post. After the whole 13-year multi-million-dollar debacle, you would think that they'd be jumping for joy. Not so. City officials seem more interested in thinking up reasons not to go forward than in making a deal. The city should give Donald Trump a speedy hearing. The woman farce has been running long enough. Let him have a go at it, said Newsday. After all, the city has proved nothing except that it can't get the job done. If there's one thing I've learned from dealing with politicians over the years, is that the only thing guaranteed to force them into action is the press. Or more specifically, fear of the press. You can apply all kinds of pressure, make all sorts of pleas and threats, contribute large sums of money to their campaigns, and generally it gets you nothing. But raise the possibility of bad press, even in an obscure publication, and most politicians will jump. Bad press translates into potential lost votes, and if a politician loses enough votes, he won't get re-elected. If that happens, he might have to go out and take a 9-to-5 job. That's the last thing most politicians want to do. What you have to understand about Ed Koch is that he's a bully, pure and simple. Bullies may act tough, but they are really closest cowards. The only people bullies push around are the ones they know they can beat. Confront a strong, competent person and he'll fight back harder than ever. Confront a bully, and in most cases he'll fold like a deck of cards. Sure enough, the tide turned overnight. No sooner did the press jump on Koch's case than he reversed field completely. Suddenly, the city was virtually begging me to take on a woman rink job. What? What do you want? What do you want, baby? Okay. Chill. Let's chill. Alright, let me continue reading. Suddenly, the city was virtually begging me to take on the woman rink job. On June 6, I sat down in my office with city officials, including Henry Stern, to negotiate the terms under which I'd rebuild the woman rink. Until then, the city had insisted on competitive bidding, as is required on any city-financed construction job. I suggested a simple solution. I'd put up all of the money for the construction of the rink myself. In turn, I'd be reimbursed over as many years as it took from any profits the rink earned. In other words, I'd not only supervise construction, I'd also lend the city $3 million for an indeterminate period, and forever if the rink didn't prove profitable. The city, in its infinite wisdom, balked. There's no way we're going to allow that. City officials told me, there's no way we're going to allow you to make a profit on the rink. No, you don't understand. I said, if the rink doesn't make money, I'll use it to reduce my loan. I'm not looking for personal profit. In fact, if I ever do get my money back, I'll give my subsequent profits to charity. To my astonishment, and to the astonishment of my own lawyers, the city wouldn't budge. Instead, they came up with a counter-proposal. I'd still put up the $3 million as a way of getting around the competitive bidding issue, but on the day I finished, the city would reimburse me in full. It's fortunate for those city officials that they chose to go into city government rather than business. The deal they were suggesting was far worse for the city than the one I'd originally offered. I wasn't about to fight them at my own expense. By the end of the day, on Friday, June 6, 10 days after my original offer, we came to an agreement, subject to final approval by the city's Board of Estimate. I'd put up the construction money and agreed to complete the work by December 15th. At that point, the city would reimburse me for my cost, up to a cap of just less than $3 million, but only if the rink worked. If I came in under budget, the city would pay me back only what I'd spent. If I went over budget, I'd cover the overruns myself. That much the city was graciously willing to let me do. I had just one challenge left, building the skating rink fast and building it right. If I failed, if I was even 1 day late or $1 over budget, my plan was to pack my bags and take the next plane to Argentina. There was no way Ed Koch or anyone else would ever let me live it down. Since I myself knew absolutely nothing about building rinks, I set out to find the best skating rink builder I could. Logic suggested that the best place to look was Canada. Ice skating is to Canadians what baseball is to Americans, the national pastime. The top builders, I figured, were probably the companies that built rinks for Canada's professional hockey teams. Sure enough, everyone I talked with agreed that a company called Simcoe, based in Toronto, was the best of the best. Among other projects, they'd built a rink for the Montreal Canadiens. I got their top guy on the phone, and I began with a very basic question. What does it take to build a great outdoor skating rink? He gave me a very quick course in rink construction. The key choice, he said, was which ice skating system to use. The city had originally decided to use a relatively new technology in which the freezing agent is fraying. The rationale was that fraying system requires less electricity, which translates into some minor energy cost savings. The disadvantage of the Freon system is that it's far more delicate, temperamental, and difficult to maintain, particularly in a public facility where personnel turns over frequently. Among ice skating facilities that use the Freon system, my friend from Simcoe told me at least one-third had experienced problems. The other option, which had been used in hundreds of skating rinks for decades, was a brine system, in which salt water is circulated through the pipes. It costs a little more to run than a Freon system, but the advantage is that it's highly reliable and incredibly durable. The Rockefeller Center skating rink has used a brine system since it opened in 1936 and has never experienced a major problem. By the time I finished my first coat, I'd made up my mind to use the brine system in rebuilding the Woman rink. The city, in fact, had finally come to the same conclusion. The only difference was that they first wasted 6 years and millions of dollars. I soon discovered that the city's incompetence on the Woman rink project had extended to every imaginable detail, large and small. On June 16, 1 week after I'd made my deal to take over rebuilding the rink, a city report was released on mistakes made at the Woman rink over the past 6 years. The study had taken 15 months to complete, 4 times what I'd given myself to totally rebuild the rink. Worse yet, while the report provided endless examples of incompetence, it came to absolutely no conclusions about who was responsible for the fiasco and what could be done to avoid such failures in the future. The one thing the report did provide was an astounding chronology of sloppiness, indecision, incompetence, and sheer stupidity. If it weren't so pathetic, it would have been almost comical. The city first closed the rink for renovations in June 1980. By the time plans had been drawn and bidding process completed, almost a year had passed. In March 1981, work finally began on installing approximately 22 miles of the very delicate, expensive copper piping used in a Freon cooling system. In the meantime, however, the Parks Department had second thoughts about where to locate the compressor room and what sort of refrigeration equipment to use. Even as the piping was being installed, all work was halted on the equipment that would eventually be needed to operate the rink's cooling system. Even if the ice-making equipment had been finished and installed, the design of the rink was such that it never had a chance of working. Specifically, the base of the rink was designed on a pitch, so that it was approximately 8 inches higher at one end than at the other. The pitch had a purpose. The fact that it ended up being 11 inches was an accident. The point of the pitch was that during the summer, the city hoped to use the rink as a reflecting pond, and apparently a pond reflects light better if its base is sloped. In the winter, however, that same sloped base would cause a problem. It doesn't take a genius to realize that when you try to make ice under those circumstances, there are only 2 possibilities. The better one is the ice will form, but that because the depth of the water varies, the consistency of the ice won't be uniform. The worse and far more likely result is that the water at the deeper end of the rink simply won't freeze at all, no matter how powerful the ice-making machinery. Even that issue soon became secondary. In July, 2 months after the laying of the pipes began, a torrential rain flooded the rink, depositing a thick layer of silt on the newly laid pipes. It wasn't until September that the Parks Department finally got around to hiring a crew to repair the damage. In the meantime, a new dispute had emerged within the Parks Department about how the concrete sidewalks surrounding the rink should be designed. The result was that the pouring of all concrete, including the concrete meant to form the rink space, was held up 9 months while debate over the sidewalk raged on. So unfortunately did winter. For 9 months, the newly laid delicate copper pipes were exposed to horrible weather. There were major snowstorms and flooding. In addition, because copper is quite valuable, vandals climbed over the fences and tried to cut off pieces of the pulp to resell. By the spring, it was as though if those 22 miles of pipes had been through a wall. Nonetheless, not one person thought to check them for possible damage. In June 1982, 2 years after the rink was first closed, the concrete was finally poured over the untested copper pipes. Contractors often use a vibrating machine when they pour over uneven surfaces, since it helps prevent bubbles from forming. However, the vibrating had an unforeseen result. It began shaking loose the joints of the copper pipes. At the same time, the contractor had even bigger problems to contend with. He had underestimated by a great deal how much concrete it would take to cover the rink. The key to pouring concrete is to do it all at once, on a continuous basis, because that's the only way to ensure it will adhere and mesh uniformly, rather than interrupt his pour. The contractor decided to dilute his concrete mixture with water. It was a recipe for disaster. Less than a week went by before cracks began appearing on the surface of the newly poured concrete slab. Not coincidentally, the cracks were concentrated at the end of the rink where the cement content had been diluted, and where the vibrating machine had been turned off. Delays in deciding where to locate the refrigeration equipment prompted another problem. By the time the city made its decision, after 16 months of deliberation, the contractor originally hired to install the equipment insisted on a modification of his original agreement. Okay, I'm getting sleepy. I'll continue reading tomorrow. Alright, interesting story. Bye. 停止录像。